Welcome to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. Today we're going to be talking about adoption subsidies for those who adopt from foster care. Negotiating these subsidies, that's an important topic. Who's eligible? We're going to cover it all today with Josh Kroll. He is the project coordinator of the Adoption Subsidy Resource Center at the North American Council on Adoptable Children. Welcome, Josh, to Creating a Family. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
We are going to be talking today about adoption subsidies. At the beginning, let's talk about what do we mean by adoption subsidies?
So when people talk about adoption subsidies, it usually includes at least one, if not all three of these supports. One is an ongoing financial support paid generally monthly that people call adoption subsidy, adoption assistance, AAP, lots of different names, stipend, maintenance, per diem. That's the first part. The second part is Medicaid, and that generally comes in almost all circumstances. And then the last one is the reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses. And that can be often fully for attorney fees, but it also could help with other costs that are for the adoption process.
And by that last one, reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses, that one is not an ongoing monthly. That is intended for the actual adoption itself. Am I correct there?
Correct.
Okay, so excellent. And we should also mention, although certainly not the topic of this course would be, you're also eligible for the adoption tax credit, the federal adoption tax credit. We have other courses on that, and NACAC, North American Council on Adoptable Children, has lots of information on that as well. So all of those, so that's just throwing that out there as another thing to be thinking about. All right. Well, first of all, who is eligible for adoption? Well, all of these adoption subsidies, the financial, the Medicaid, and the reimbursement.
So the states administer the program, and in some states, the states delegate it down to the counties. But the states set the rules on who is eligible. And it's designed for children in the public foster care system, although some private domestic adoptions could be eligible. And it's going to vary greatly from state to state. It's for children who are considered hard to place or special needs. And what that is in each state varies a lot.
All right. Now, I'm sure everyone's ears have immediately perked up when they think that private domestic infant adoption might be eligible. In the states, and I heard what you said, that it's only in some states. And when the states that it is allowed, what is that? Just any adoption, or is it only adoption of a child that they consider special needs?
For the private domestic adoptions, those children typically are going to have to be either SSI eligible prior to finalization, and then the family will have to apply in their state of residency, even if the child's placed from another state, and then get approved. And there are ways that states have created some hurdles, maybe intentionally, maybe not intentionally, to make it even more challenging to do it. No state will categorically say that a private domestic's not eligible, but they definitely can make it more challenging. And then the other population is children who receive Title IV-E, that's federal funding, Title IV adoption assistance in a previous adoption. So like if I adopted a child and my adoption dissolves, or I pass away, and Dawn, you decide to adopt that child, and that child, I got Title IV adoption assistance, that child wouldn't have to re-enter the foster care system. You could just do a straight attorney adoption of that child. But since you live in North Carolina, you're going to have to apply for adoption assistance with the state of North Carolina for that readoption.
So the adoption assistance, are you telling me, doesn't follow the child? So Billy was adopted in Illinois, and Billy's adoptive parents have adoption assistance from the state of Illinois. That adoption dissolves. Billy is readopted from, let's say, a family in New York. Uh, would the original adoption assistance that was being provided by the state of Illinois follow Billy into his new home or not?
Nope, they would have to apply in the new one. There are a handful of states, I think off the top of my head, the ones I can think of: New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, I think on a time-limited basis, and Nebraska may extend it even after like an adoptive parent's death. But in most cases, it would terminate in the situation you described.
So it doesn't follow the child per se. It is to the family, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but
Well, they're parties to the contract, and if they're, if their parental rights have terminated, that's grounds for it to end.
that makes sense because there's a contract between the parents and the state. You had said that in some states it may be possible for a child adopted not through foster care, a child adopted privately, to get adoption assistance if they're SSI eligible. So what do you mean by SSI eligibility?
So the Social Security Administration, for people with severe disabilities that don't have a work record, which are children, they don't have work records. They can apply.
Lazy little bums.
Yeah, the families or the agencies, and oftentimes it's easier if it's the agencies, can apply for supplemental security income based on the disabilities of the child. Common ones you might see in our world of adoption: Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, maybe spina bifida. Down syndrome is probably the most common one I hear of. But those are things that if they're able to get SSI for the child before finalization, then they can apply for adoption assistance with the state that they live in, the adoptive parents.
All right. Is there an income limit for receiving the adoption subsidy? Let's say a family, makes a very good income and doesn't technically, and I'm using air quotes here, need the subsidy in order to support the child. Would they be eligible?
Technically, yes, except it's complicated, like everything in life. It's complicated.
Yes.
So there's two types of adoption subsidy. There's the federally funded one, which means the state's getting reimbursed a portion of the dollars. And then there's the non-4E, which the state is paying all of it, or in some states, the county and the state are paying some of it. The federally one, they cannot means test. They can't say, Bill Gates technically could adopt a child and get adoption assistance, but the one exception is there are two states for the non-4E children, Louisiana and Ohio, do means test their state program. So if you have a kid who's non-4E eligible in Louisiana or Ohio, there is an income test for the families. In Ohio, it's a pretty high amount. It's not too bad. I think it's 110 or 130% of median income, and it's based on family size. But in Louisiana, it's pretty low. But there can be exceptions that can go up to the state office to overrule that. But where families of more comfortable incomes will probably run into a bigger issue is in the states that negotiate the rate. Some states provide what the child was getting in foster care or a similar amount, and there's a maximum rate, and families are just, this is what the most we can offer the child. Will you take it? And the family says yes. But in other states, they look at the family's resources, they look at the child's needs, and in those states, they'd be more likely to get a lower amount, not get nothing, but be offered a substantially lower monthly amount.
Okay, well that begs the I guess $64 million question, or not that anybody should be expecting that. However, that begs the bigger question, which is, how is the dollar amount of the subsidy determined, and by whom?
It's going to be determined on the state that is providing the adoption subsidy. So for kids in the foster care system, it's the foster care system the child is in. So, I'm in Minnesota. If I adopt little Billy from Illinois, I don't look at Minnesota's rate structure, and I don't look at Minnesota's eligibility criteria. I look at Illinois because Billy's in Illinois foster care. If Billy is a child with Down syndromes and being placed privately with me and gets SSI, I'm applying here in Minnesota, then I look at Minnesota's rate structure and Minnesota's eligibility criteria. So
does the state have it set that, okay, all children at this age with this level of need get X amount, or all the families of children that meet those criteria get X amount, and is it a non-negotiable? It is a set amount that it is determined, written down somewhere in state law, or is it a little fuzzier as to the amount?
Most states have pretty concrete rate structures for foster care, and that's generally the guideline for adoption subsidy. So most states have a system set up like you described. So there's usually a basic rate, and that could be for a child without very many issues. And that may have a different amount based on what age they are. And then they may have what's called a level, a difficulty of care, specialized, lots of different terms, CANs, that could provide more based on the specific needs of a child. So like if I have a sibling group of 2, I might have one child who's getting a basic rate because they don't generally have many needs, but their sibling has significant needs and might be getting a much higher amount. And what happens is those amounts generally are the ceiling on what the adoption assistance can be. And in states that offer the same rates and don't make you negotiate, that's what the child is going to be looking at in support once they're adopted. Some other states have structural lower limits. In Minnesota, children adopted under the age of 6 will get half of their foster care rate. That's in our state law. In Washington State, kids they negotiate, but it's up to 80% for kids 0 to 4 or 5, and then up to 9, it's 95%, and then 10 to 18, it's 95% of the foster care rate. So it really depends on the state and how they structure things.
So how can parents find out, assuming they may or may not be a foster parent at the time, how can they find out how much they would be eligible for, or their child would be eligible?
I would definitely suggest they go visit the NACAC website, which is nacac.org, and check out our list of state profiles. There's at a glance, which just gives a sort of a summary of the different rates, basic rates at different ages. But what folks would really want to do if they're interested in a specific child from a specific state, or if they're adopting privately and they think they might adopt a child with special needs that might get SSI, they'd want to look at their specific state. And we have state profiles for each state. And generally I think it's question 4 and 5 have the information on the rates, and may have some details on even what qualifies children for certain rates, depending on the state.
Yes, it's a great resource. That would be NACAC, nacac.org. All right. So you say, depending on the needs of the child, it may go up or down. Who makes a decision on the needs of the child? Is that based on if the child is actively in therapy? Is it dependent upon behavior? What is it dependent upon?
It's, level of foster home can be part of it, but really it should be based on the needs of the child. This is all about the child, and the reason I highlight that is sometimes people talk about themselves in asking if the child's eligible, and it really shouldn't be about themselves. And I want to highlight it, especially for relatives. Relatives, because there are a lot of kinship providers, they can be eligible for this. Being grandpa or auntie or whatever doesn't disqualify the child's eligibility for adoption assistance. So those higher rates can be the physical disabilities, which are generally pretty obvious to people, but a lot of the children in care have had a lot of trauma, may have experienced abuse or neglect, both which are very traumatic and often, sad to say, have behavioral issues. And those are definitely a factor in higher rates.
But if the child is not actively in therapy, what do the negotiators, what do the social workers, what do they rely on in determining that if the child is if the child is in therapy, if the child is not in therapy, is there needs to be a report by the therapist? Is it a report by the parents on what they're seeing? How do they know?
It's going to depend on the state. Majority of kids that qualify for this are adopted from the foster care system, and there are high numbers adopted by the foster parents. But for those who aren't, they're probably going to have that information. If you're not already fostering this child, they're going to have that information available that's to you. But it really depends on how the state reports, determines things. Another thing that some states do, they factor in the time the parent spends with the child. Like here in Minnesota, they use a term, I don't know if they still use it anymore, but in the past they used it, activities of daily living based on the child's age. If you've got a 8-year-old that still can't get themselves dressed in the morning and you got to spend time being on top of that, that's something that may factor into a little higher rate than just the basic rate. But that's stuff that, that someone has to be reporting on. This is, it's government. Everything has to be recorded to justify these higher rates.
So does it behoove a foster parent who is considering adopting, or anyone who is considering adopting from foster care, to be thinking in terms of making a case for why the child's needs are, what the child actually needs? And again, I will go back to stressing what you're saying. This is not about mercenary foster parents trying to get everything they could possibly get, just, so they can go sit around and eat bonbons or go to the Caribbean or something. Right. This is because there is a concern that the child will need care and they want to be able to provide the care for the child. So should they be making notes, talking with the child's therapist, whomever, teachers or whatever, as to what others are seeing as far as the child's needs?
As a foster parent, I would, if I'm new, I would talk to experienced foster parents in my area and talk about what my child's needs are and talk about, hey, this is the rate the child's getting now. Does this seem appropriate to you? Because there's a lot of experience. There's also a lot of human factor in how things are done. There isn't a state in this country where it probably depends how something is written up can make a difference between one rate or another. And so I would definitely focus on that. And, if you've got a younger child that's starting to present some things, but no one's diagnosed it yet, I would see if I could get a diagnosis in case that increases the ceiling for the child. Most states, families can renegotiate adoption assistance. So, when you've got a really young child that no one wants to make a diagnosis, that's not going to be a really big issue. But, it's sometimes the negotiation process isn't fun. So you might want to try and get as much done as you can. But if you got a kid that's under 3 that's qualifying, they may not really want to do any diagnosis yet until the kid's school age. That's a real big issue that families face.
Let me pause here to remind everyone that you are listening to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. And today we're talking with Josh Kroll with the North American Council on Adoptable Children. And we're talking about adoption subsidies for adoptions primarily through foster care. This show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Jockey Being Family. Calling all adoption agencies, they want you to know that it is one of the services that they provide is their backpack program. And in this wonderful, cute, customized backpack, it is initialed with the child's name. Parents get material. The child, of course, gets material. The child gets a backpack. It gets an adorable little bear and a blanket. But inside, also, there is a tote bag, and it's full of parenting resources for the parents themselves to help them transition into adoption. And this is open to all adoptions, regardless whether they're from international or domestic or foster care. So if you know of a family who is adopting, or if you are a family who is adopting and would like for your agency to participate, contact Jockey Being Family. Just go to their website, probably the easiest thing, which is jockeybeingfamily.com. And you can click on their backpack program, and there's a place for the agency to register. So pop over there and make sure you're doing that, because it's a great resource. I'm glad you raised the issue, Josh, about situations where the child is either too young to be displaying needs or to be diagnosed, or is not displaying the need, but the parents have reason to believe that the child may have needs as they age. A common scenario would be prenatal exposures. There, either the child was born dependent or not, because we know that the impact of prenatal exposures is not necessarily connected to whether or not the child was born dependent. Neonatal abstinence syndrome is present or not. So, but that parents may know that the birth mom used alcohol or drugs through her pregnancy and have reason to believe that the child may be impacted. But at this point, it's too young, because honestly, some of those impacts do not show until school age. So what's a parent to do then when they want to be proactive to make certain that they can provide services as soon as possible for their child? But at this point, they have no reason. The child's too young. And they don't want to have to renegotiate, because that's hard. And you don't have much bargaining. But once it's your child at that point, and you don't have much bargaining power on the renegotiation. So what should parents do then to try to make certain that there is something, even if they don't want it now, they just want it there to get without having to go through the renegotiation? Is that possible?
Well, there are quite a few states that provide what they call $0 deferred or dormant, or they might use other terms, high risk agreements. And those provide $0. So if the child's not meeting any other category, because I just want to mention that it's not just disabilities, but also there can be an age component. It's as low as 1 for little Billy in Illinois, to as high as 12 in Kansas, and a couple states without an age component, and siblings being adopted. So if I'm adopting a kid who was prenatally exposed with their sibling, that child more likely than not is going to be eligible for adoption subsidy, because they're being adopted as a sibling group. But let's say it's a child that isn't being adopted with a sibling, hasn't met the age criteria, and otherwise isn't meeting any other of the state's criteria. Some states also still have race as a criteria. And so these states, and there's quite a few of them, it's probably, I would guess, at least half. Should do a summary at some point. But quite a few states have these $0 agreements that basically they say, here, you have an adoption assistance agreement. It gives you no monthly payment. Most of the time it's going to give Medicaid, and probably the non-recurring. And what that does is it provides that safety net, so that if later on problems arise when you can start making diagnosis and things are starting to show up, you can then go back to the state and say, my child now has X, Y, or Z. We need to get the monthly payment started. And so that's it's a great safety net. And then, states are doing it to make the process easier to go back and provide that help. So that's what I would encourage. In our profiles question, I believe it's 7 or 8. I think it's 8 on our each state profile addresses that. Does the state provide such an agreement?
And it is certainly something to consider. And if you never need it, then fine. It just never comes into effect. But if third grade, you say, for instance, third grade, you start seeing that your child is really struggling with some of the higher level thinking skills that kick in at that point and is falling behind, and you're wanting to hire a tutor or wanting to put them in a special school for kids with learning differences or whatever, that's at the time you might be able to go back and reinstitute change it from a $0 to a whatever the state offers for children with that need.
The one thing I will highlight on there are some states that specifically say the thing that activates it has to be something that they could tie to before the adoption. So like if I get into a car accident with little Billy and he now is in a wheelchair, that's not going to qualify. But if they determine that he's on the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but no one ever knew that mom was drinking, then, that would qualify because that clearly predated the adoption. So that's just a little wrinkle that some states have.
Yeah, I would think that would be the standard one. So the challenge for the parent is to make certain with the diagnosis that if they have this information and if they can get this diagnosis, that the child's struggles, in the case we just mentioned, might be connected to prenatal exposure or trauma or abuse or neglect or whatever it was the child may have experienced before. All right. Does the money have to be spent directly and solely on the foster child, or could it also be used to benefit the whole family or the foster child only tangentially, such as adding on a bedroom so that the kids don't have to share or something along those lines? What can the money be used for?
Pretty much for anything. The family has to financially support the child, but they're unlike Social Security Administration. Like if I'm the representative payee for someone who's getting Social Security benefits, I have to document how I'm spending that money on that person. The adoption assistance does not require that. And in federal law, it talks about it's to meet the needs of the child. In federal policy, it talks about ordinary and special needs of the child, including things like childcare. But federal policy also says that there is no accounting the state can require of how exactly the money is spent, but to use it however the family feels is best to fit the child into the household. But they have to financially support the child.
Can they commingle the money? Can they just take the money each month and put it into the general family banking account and it's used for everything else that's, all the other bills that come in? Is that possible as well?
It is.
Okay.
Because it's technically a payment to the parents. I actually had a case in the last couple of years in Wisconsin where a mom was saving it up in a general family fund, and then when they went to divorce, the divorcing spouse was going after that money that had been saved up from the adoption subsidy payment. I don't know a way to fight that one, but I'm not an expert on spousal on divorce and asset splitting.
Well, and that changes significantly by state too, but it sounds like in the case that you're familiar with, it was considered just part of the family money and did not follow the child exclusively to whichever parent that child was living with. Is that how that one turned out? Yeah.
I don't know if it's totally been resolved yet.
Interesting.
People don't always call me back, especially if it's bad news. So, I mean, it's just a reality. Yeah. It ends up, I have limits in what I find out from people in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that matters. Can you give us an estimate where the states range, knowing that there is some flexibility on how much, depending on what state you're in, your child may be eligible for? Knowing full well that you're saying that the higher amounts usually go to older children, sibling groups with diagnosed special needs.
I mean, technically zero at the lower end. Some states negotiate pretty low rates, even without the, at-risk category. There's probably definitely over 1,000 in quite a few places for, like medically fragile children, and in some places going to be over 2, but not super common. There's it's hard to say. It really depends on the specific state.
Okay.
But over 1,000 is definitely, unless you're in a really high cost of living area, and even some of those, it's not going to be that high. For a basic rate, it's 800 or 900 is going to be the very top end for basic rates. But more common, anywhere from 300 to 500 for a basic rate in a lot of states.
And like you point out, this is not intended to take away the cost of parenting and raising a child. It's supposed to be, as the name implies, a subsidy to help pay for some of the added costs that this child might have by virtue of the fact of their experience in the foster care system.
I mean, if you want, you can think of it as right now, for the kids in foster care, the state is the legal parent, and it's like they're paying child support to the adoptive family.
Because the adoptive parent, but for the adoption, the state would be continuing to pay for the child, all of the child's living expenses. And so, yeah. Okay. All right. You had mentioned that there were we mentioned primarily three types of subsidies. One was the financial assistance. The second one you mentioned was Medicaid. And then the third one you mentioned was reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses. Let's talk about Medicaid. Do all states automatically include children who are adopted through foster care in coverage under Medicaid?
No. So the kids who get Title IV adoption assistance in every state will get Medicaid, and that's even if they move to another state. Because that's one of the rules with that those federal dollars. Okay, so you get federal dollars. The kid has to and has an adoption assistance agreement. The kid is on Medicaid. They can't do anything about that. Okay, and if you have private insurance, you can make that secondary. You're not required to. I mean, as healthcare gets more expensive for families and individuals, sometimes you don't want to put the child on your private insurance because of how expensive it would be. Kids who receive non-4E adoption assistance, most states will provide Medicaid. I know off the top of my head, Alabama and Virginia, and there might be just a couple more, they require the child to have some sort of disability that warrants Medicaid for the non-4E kids. So if the kid gets adoption assistance because they're hard to place, but they're not 4E eligible, they may not get Medicaid in some of those states. The other place that it's messy with the non-4E kids is moving states. So if you get Medicaid from whatever state you live in, or and you decide to move, you adopted a kid in your home state. I'm in Minnesota. I adopted a kid in Minnesota, and I decide I'm tired of Minnesota winter, so I'm going to move down to Florida because hurricanes seem easier. And right? I should joke about that to North Carolina, but
at least it seems warmer. Let's put it that way.
It's definitely going to be warmer.
Yeah.
So I moved down to Florida. What I need to do in that situation is I need to contact the state of Minnesota. In our state, we have specialists, and tell them I'm moving so that they can send the paperwork from St. Paul to Tallahassee and get Medicaid set up in the new state. So it's the Interstate Compact on Adoption and Medical Assistance. And so whoever's paying the adoption subsidy, you need to contact them so they can send the paperwork over and get the Medicaid set up in the new state. Now, when it's 4E, not a problem, works in every state. When it's non-4E, all but 4 states will provide it. Well, it's sort of 7. We'll start with the 4 states. There's 4 states that will not provide Medicaid to kids who get non-4E adoption subsidy from another state. And those states currently are Hawaii, Nevada, New Mexico, and Illinois. So those 4 states, if I'm in Minnesota, I adopt a non-4E kid and I move to New Mexico, I'm not going to get Title 4E. I'm not going to get Medicaid for that child. If I moved to Arizona, I would. Now, Iowa, Pennsylvania, New York will do it for kids from all states except from those 4 states. So if I adopt a kid from New Mexico in Minnesota, I get non-4E subsidy. that kid will get Medicaid in Minnesota because Minnesota was awesome. But I then move to Illinois. I won't get Medicaid in that state, or not Illinois, sorry, wrong state. I moved to Iowa. Iowa will not do it because it's a New Mexico kid, but they would for a Minnesota kid. So
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
messy.
they're saying, if you won't do it for our kids, we're not going to do it for you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So
now you're talking about,
that's the messy
go
part.
Yeah, well, so you're talking about children, and the term you're using is non-Title IV eligible. What type of kids does that typically include? What kids would be eligible under their state, but for subsidies, but not from the federal subsidy under Title IV?
So for kids to be Title IV eligible, they either have to be an infant born to a foster child who is receiving Title IV foster care payments that cover both the foster parent and the infant. That'd make the infant Title IV for adoption subsidy. They're eligible for SSI. They were adopted previously and received Title IV adoption assistance in their previous adoption, or they were found to be AFDC eligible, which is the old welfare program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, that ended in 1996, but they still use those income guidelines. The states still do AFDC determinations in the month of removal. So those are the old ways. There are 3 new ways that started in 2009, and that is kids who've been in care more than 5 years, kids who are, at the time it was 16, now it's kids over the age of 2, or kids who are being adopted with siblings who either been in care for 5 years or over the age of 2. And the age of 2 is going to be for a couple more years. It had actually gone down to 0, but a federal law rolled back to age 2. So if I'm adopting Billy and Billy's little sister Sally from Illinois, and they're not 4E because they didn't meet the AFDC determination the month they were removed, but Billy is 3 now, Sally will be able to piggyback on Billy being 3 to make them both 4E eligible. So it's going to be a very small population, but it's still, there's still kids out there that would meet that situation.
Who would not be 4E eligible.
Correct.
That's a small population.
Thank you for clarity. Yeah. The other thing is, to qualify for 4E, and this is very rare. Partially, if it's not an issue, we don't hear calls, but there were two instances in 21 years of doing this where I've heard where the judicial determination was done wrong when the child was removed into foster care, and that invalidated the child's eligibility for 4E regardless of that laundry list I just gave. But that's very rare because it's should be pretty boilerplate language by the Child Protection Services.
Yeah, you would think so. And you'd also think that if there was a mistake that would be, correct. It could be correctable, but I guess, like you say, that's the exception, not the rule. Okay. All right. So for Medicaid, and the advantages to being under Medicaid are it's good coverage, and it's and the parents aren't having to pay for it. Are there other advantages or other things that are included in Medicaid that depending on how what type of insurance the parents have, Medicaid might well be better. So are there other reasons that parents would want their kids on Medicaid?
From what I've heard, I'm not a health policy expert at all, but from what I've heard, it seems like a lot of children who have been in foster care have quite a few behavioral issues. Not all of them, thankfully, but quite a few do. And I believe private insurance tends to have more limits on how much mental health or counseling services you can get than Medicaid seems to. That's my impression. I don't know if you're familiar or not there.
It's certainly my impression as well, depending on, there are some phenomenal insurance plans out there, and they seem to be in larger companies that have more competitive workforces, and so they have very good health insurance, and it's sometimes it's not terribly expensive to put children on them. So those would be the exception. But if you're buying your insurance independently, you're darn right it's more expensive to get. I mean, all of that can be, it's definitely more expensive the more you add, the better your coverage.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, I mean, if you have your child on private insurance, sometimes there can be conflict from what I've heard with who gets billed for what. Medicaid should be second, and then it gets a bigger mess if someone's military and it's TRICARE, because both of them try to go secondary, Medicaid and and TRICARE. But I mean, I would always keep a child on it, and like if you have copays and you have if you have copays, I think a lot of times if you have double insurance for the child, you may not have those copays, which doesn't hurt.
Right.
I mean, the other hard part with like the therapy, the counseling stuff is sometimes the best of those folks don't take Medicaid. There's definitely some attachment therapists out there that are wonderful, just what the child needs, but you got to pay out of pocket for. That's
Well, and that's where, in theory, where the adoption subsidy would come in.
Yep.
Because you're right. Particularly some of the mental health providers don't. You had a great segue for me for our next question, which was, if you've got Medicaid and TRICARE, is that which one takes the lead?
I don't remember. I think it might be Medicaid, but I'm not sure. I would talk with the military people, because they're probably more experienced with the intersection than Medicaid people.
Yeah, and you've got a better contact.
Yeah.
There's humans at the end of that phone call.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what you would do if you're in the military and you have TRICARE and you have a question on how it intersects with Medicaid. Contact your military rep who you usually ask your questions about TRICARE too. Okay. All right. What type of other things might be included in adoption assistance, kind of generally? And the one that's coming to mind is, in my mind, is college tuition discounts or waivers for state schools. Not all states do it, but some do. How many? I mean, is that becoming more common, less common?
I don't think it's becoming more common, but it's definitely out there. Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, Connecticut have really good programs. Kentucky too. Maryland and Virginia are a little more limited, and those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head. There are some other programs. I think Oklahoma has something, but I can't remember how it works. It's a little different than like Texas and Florida. They have a tuition waiver program. So if the kid's adopted from the foster care system, so all these kids who might qualify for adoption assistance through, being SSI eligible, they're not going to qualify, because this is for kids that were in the state care. And what those states do is they, you have to look each specific one, because they all work a little differently, but they waive the fees and tuitions for going to colleges, public state colleges or universities in those states, and usually include community colleges also.
Mm-hmm. And if you adopt a child from another state, the subsidy is being paid by the state that had custody of the child that you adopted. You live in Virginia and you adopt a child in West Virginia. West Virginia would be paying the subsidy. What about for college, though?
The kid wasn't. You got to reverse it, but I mean I mean, like I was talking last week to someone who lives in Georgia, adopted a kid from Florida. It's like, yes, the kid will have the Florida tuition waiver program, but they have to go back to Florida and go to a Florida state school. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. There's no one has reciprocity. The only one that I've seen is Connecticut, and I have to do a little digging on it, but I just don't get any calls. It looks like theirs may work outside of Connecticut, but I'm not entirely sure. They're the only one that looks like it might work for not Connecticut schools.
Wow.
And Kentucky, I know this one specifically, they will waive the in-state tuition fees. But if I live, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I want my kid to go to some school across the river in Covington and I get the tuition waiver, I'm an out-of-state student. I got to pay the difference between the out-state and in-state rate. The in-state part gets covered with the waiver, but the difference I would have to pay for.
When you said at the beginning it's complicated, it's complicated.
Uh-huh.
But it's not
What's crazy
impossible.
is this is all in my brain. That's the craziest part.
Oh, Josh, I wouldn't want to be in your brain.
Let me add one more thing, because we talked about the state programs. There are 2 federal programs that apply to kids adopted from foster care in any state, regardless of whether they have a tuition waiver program or not. So kids who are adopted at age 13 or older, basically were in foster care, can apply as an independent student on their FAFSA form. So that free application for federal student aid, they would not have to put parental income. And then kids who are in foster care at age 16 and older, but still adopted, they can apply for education and training voucher funds through the independent living program. And that's available to them because they were in foster care at age 16 or older. So those are going to apply in any state. I don't know how ETV, the Education and Training Fund, works if you're across state lines. If you've been adopted from the state you were in foster care in. But the free application to federal student aid as an independent student shouldn't be a big problem, no matter where you are. But those are 2 other programs that are available for kids adopted anywhere in the country at older ages from foster care.
And both are big deals because, for example, the FAFSA, if it's the child's income, the child may well have 0 income. And if they have much from, flipping burgers at McDonald's, it still wouldn't be a lot. So the percentage, and oftentimes it's grants, not loans. So especially for, you'd have a higher percentage of grants, not loans. So that's something to certainly consider at that point. Okay, excellent. Let me pause here to remind you that this show is brought to you by the support of our partners, and these are agencies that believe in our mission of providing unbiased, accurate information to both pre- and post-adoptive families. 2 of our wonderful partners are Children's Connection. They're an adoption agency providing services for domestic infant adoption and embryo donation and adoption throughout the U.S., as well as providing home studies and post-adoption support to families in Texas. We also have Spence Chapin. They are a licensed and accredited nonprofit organization in the New York City metro area that has been offering adoption services for more than, wait for it, 100 years. That's amazing. Their robust post-adoption services provides birth parents, adoptive parents, and adoptee a supportive community and a connection to professionals. So we thank our partners for making this show possible. So thank you. How can people get information about what their state usually grants for adoption subsidies, as well as what their state does as far as college tuition and Medicaid and all of that? You've mentioned the NACAC, NACAC.org, North American Council on Adoptable Children.org. It's a wonderful resource. So we mentioned that. What else? Where else can people get information?
The childwelfare.gov does have a more limited profile. So they have some information. You can check your state websites. They sometimes are really great and sometimes like, okay, I can't figure anything else here. Families who are adopting, who are doing the foster to adopt program, are probably getting a basic overview of the program when they're going through the process. Obviously, if I'm going through the process in my state and I'm not getting a placement that I'm interested in, I start looking broader, like on Adopt US Kids website or, Northwest Adoption Exchange or someone else's. I might not have much background on what that state does of a child I'm interested in, and I'm going to need to do some research. But our website is pretty well designed. Our surveys to answer the questions that we think, because we talk to thousands and tens of thousands of people, that families are really looking for.
Yeah, it's an excellent resource. I agree. So, what should parents do if they believe that the adoption subsidy that's being offered is not enough?
It's going to depend on why they think that. If they think my child should qualify for, like if I'm here in Minnesota, where we, outside of our structural issue for the kids under 6 at permanency, if I think that my child assessment didn't include some things that, ended up with a lower assessment, I'm going to want to see what the rules on doing an assessment. And if the agreement is done and executed, I'm going to have to wait 6 months until after finalization to get a reassessment. If it's not executed, but it's been proposed, I could ask for a reevaluation at the time. But if I'm in like Ohio and my county is offering $250, but I was getting $800 a month in foster care, then it's a different issue of trying to say what the needs are and advocating in the negotiation process. So it depends, like everything here, it depends on the situation. The one thing I will say is I probably answer around 1,000 calls a year on this and do some trainings. So people can call me because I know how the states work. And can give tips specific to their state or what's going on. And if I don't, we do have volunteers in quite a few states who often know some things that I don't know about those specific states, because trying to track 50 states is a bit of work and keep it all in my brain. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest you get a computer,
Well, I have that too, but I do have a lot in my brain. Like I'm not checking any notes in everything I'm telling you today.
Yeah, I believe that actually.
Yeah.
So how would people reach you?
They can call us toll free, 800-470-6665. And we got a new phone system, so my extension is changed since the last time. It's 115. So it's 800-470-6665, extension 115, or my email is joshk, Joshk, at NACAC, NACAC.org. And if you call here, you forget the extension, you talk about Subsidy, they will quickly get you to me. Unless I'm gone for like vacation or something. Those calls, no one else is going to try and
no
field
one
those.
wants those calls. They're going to, don't worry. They will go to you.
Well, no. We have some other staff that will help, but I'm the coordinator for a reason, and that's my primary job.
So how is residential treatment covered? Let's assume that, I know, it's the thing that is, it's the boogaboo. I mean, it's the thing that we hear probably some of the most questions about. So how is residential treatment covered? You've got a child who is really struggling, and either you've made the decision or doctors have made the decision and your family is drowning and residential treatment is being considered. What then?
You got to talk to whatever government agency is in your area, where you live. You might, if you have adoption subsidy from another state, you might talk to them, and everybody does it a little different. But most states, if they're doing it in any way, shape, or form, Medicaid's going to be part of it, but you might get Department of Mental Health. You're going to be talking about trying to get various funding streams to help cover the placement. And the state will probably try and go after the adoption subsidy by seeking child support. They're not going to cut it off. You don't want it to be cut off, because if they cut it off, unless it's a suspend, it's just going to create problems later, especially if the child can get better and be reunified. So it's one of those things I'm happy to talk with folks on and share what I've heard about what your state has done. if if you've got Medicaid for the child, which you should, if you have Medicaid for the child and Medicaid saying they're not going to help at all with finding anything, and the hard part is, sometimes Medicaid will help with a placement, but you don't feel the placements meet the needs of the child and won't really help. That is a different battle. But there's a group that helps fight for people with disabilities. There's a chapter in every state, and they're either called Disability Rights or Protection and Advocacy. And you can find your state chapter on the N as in Nancy, D as in David, R as in Ronald, N as in Nancy, .org website, the National Disability Rights Network. And that's a way to help work with an organization to do that. California is weird. They can make the adoption subsidy for up to 18 months go up to like $7,000, $8,000. I don't get it. It creates a problem with families who adopted from other states living in California and trying to get help because their solution is a little different. But generally it's trying to look at what sort of services in talking with broader, take off the adoption blinders, see what other community resources, what mental health resources might help. Don't think the child welfare system is the only resource to solve this problem. The other issue, you probably hear this little too, and I don't have a great answer to this, other than trying to get states to change their laws, is what happens if the facility says, we can't do anymore. This child is not progressing. We're going to return the child, and you feel that child is still not safe to come back in your home, like could actually harm family members. And the family says, we're not going to take the child back. And then does the state pursue abandonment or neglect charges against the adoptive family, who would otherwise be charged with endangering another child in the family if they took the child home? I mean, it's a catch-22 that I don't have an answer for. But, we might have resources or connections in the state that might be able to help families navigate that situation.
I will say that it is certainly being discussed now, certainly more than it was even 5 years ago. So I think most people are aware that it's I guess this is, to put it mildly, a conundrum, that it is that catch-22 that parents are caught in. So, contact the agency from whom you adopted and start working there. And that would be the first stop for that. So what all do you think will change with the implementation of the Families First Act, both about subsidies and also about post-adoption services in general? So let's start first about Families First and if it has any impact, well, not just subsidies, but subsidies, Medicaid, college, the whole thing.
I'm not sure. I'm not as versed in the Families First Act. Sorry to say, that's been more my boss, Mary Boo. I mean, I know the biggest impact was it rolled back the applicable age. I said was 2, it got down to 0 and came back to 2. That's the biggest change that's directly impacted adoption subsidy. NACAC is always been a huge proponent of post-adoption services because a check is nice. A check can really help make a difference, but a lot of times that check is not even close to enough. And sometimes it's not even, like helping cover the cost of residential treatment, which usually that adoption subsidy is not going to come close to, but also not feeling isolated and alone in the world. There are parents I've talked to who I don't feel like I helped at all, but when they told me their story and they knew that I understood and didn't say they were crazy, that this happens to other people, that I think relieved them a little bit. So we do a lot with parent support groups, but also can families get respite? I mean, respite is huge because families need a break, especially with children with extreme behavioral issues, but also other times too. But I don't know all the funding streams. I think, did it do more dedicated funding for post-adopt? Did it say that a certain percentage had to be in?
Yeah.
Okay.
It does. So the expectation is that there will be more money going to post-adoption for certain. That's in fact, there's, I think, a requirement that a set percentage of adoption assistance money has to go to post-adoption, and it can be used by families, by adoptive families. It can also be, some of the services can also, of course, be used by birth families. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is, yes, there is, one of the things is, if we can get to states, and the hard part is if we can get information about dissolved adoptions or these residential treatments, is family preservation services that can be used to help keep adoptions together when they're strained. I mean, that is something, but the key is for listeners, it's like, what is your state doing? Do you know? Probably not. Are you involved with organizations that are going to help focus how the state does that? Because if you don't, that money is probably going to be spent before you even might try and access it. Big part of advocacy is being at the table when they start divvying up the money. Not like, oh, they're getting money. Let's start talking. Who do we talk to about this?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so that's all going to be coming down the pike in the next year or so. So excellent. Well, thank you so much, Josh Kroll, for being with us today to talk about adoption subsidies for adoptions primarily through foster care. As always, the views expressed in this show are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the position of creating a family, our partners, or our underwriters. And keep in mind that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how it applies to your specific situation, you need to work with your adoption professional. I am sure everybody is going to want to contact Josh to get more information. And the website is NACAC, NACAC.org. Or, as he pointed out, you can email him directly at joshk@nacac.org. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I will see you next week.